Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final webinar in this series on public data collection. The topic of today's webinar is preparing for recovery of council tax. As usual, this webinar has been set up in partnership with the IRV, and I'm pleased again to be joined by a great panel, the Chair of the Chief Executive of the IRV, David Magor, Nick Rowe, who's the Assistant Director of Local Tax and Accounts Receivable at the London Borough of Ealing, and he's also the Chair of the London Revenues Group. Jonathan Woolridge, who's the Head of Revenues at London Borough of Redbridge, and also joined today by my colleague Chris Warburton, who's at Arum. And later on this afternoon, around 1:15, we'll be joined by Joseph Surtees, who's the Head of Policy Government Debt Management Function. So thank you guys for joining us again. Let's start with the usual introductions. David, can you give us a quick introduction to yourself and who you are, what you do?
I am David Magor. I'm the Chief Executive of the Institute of Revenues Rating and Valuation, and in a former life I was a local government officer. I ended my local government career as Director of Housing and Revenues at Oxford City Council, and I've been with the Institute since the year 2000.
Thank you. Nick, over to you.
Okay, Nick Rowe, Assistant Director of Revenues at London Borough of Ealing. About 35 years, unfortunately, experience in local taxation collection. I think the last 3 months have aged me more than the first 34.9 months, I think. So, but yeah, so a fair bit of experience, and hopefully today we can cover off some of the issues people are facing.
Thank you. Jonathan, 33 years or not?
Thanks, Forrest. Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jonathan Woolridge. I'm the Head of Revenues for the London Borough of Redbridge. I've been in post there for just over 2 years, but come with about 28 years worth of experience. And like Nick, I've really felt the pain of the last few months. And I'm always ready for a challenge, but this one has surpassed all challenges that I've seen in my career so far. But bring it on. We're ready for the next one now. I think ever ready.
Great. Chris, please, thanks for joining us for the first time in this series. Please give us a quick introduction to yourself.
Yeah, my name is Chris Warburton. I'm Principal Consultant at Arum. We do a variety of engagements, including local authorities. And my background in collections is probably up, to be honest, it's probably up near the 28 years as well. So in a variety of different places before I joined Arum. And I've been with Arum about 4 years, so it's been very interesting. So we've been quite involved in terms of just really sort of monitoring the response to COVID, particularly around some of the exit planning. And just putting some thought really behind that in terms of what are the steps to take and how to think through some of those things. So that's what we've been sort of pretty busy with since all this started.
Great, and the feedback that we've had from our audience is that they really do appreciate your experience and knowledge of the collection. So thank you for joining us. Just give you a quick 30-second introduction to me. My name is Farid Mir, and I've been chairing these webinars. My background is principally in local government. I was a local officer for the best part of in various councils across the country, head of performance latterly at the Manchester City Council. Also spent a brief stint on secondment to the Cabinet Office doing some policy and improvement work on local government nationally. And more recently, I've been doing consulting here in the UK, but also in various other around the world. And I joined Arum just under 2 years ago. So my collections experience is a lot less than you guys, but I've done a lot more work around sort of business process improvement in services. So thank you. Let me get some housekeeping stuff out of the way. I hope you can all hear us. If you can't, please email our moderators or use the moderator chat panel, and hopefully we can for you. You won't be able to see each other or hear each other, but we are interested in your thoughts. So please use the Q&A button you should see on the right hand side to send us your questions. I'll be monitoring those and hopefully raising some of those with the panel during the chat. Any questions that we don't cover, indeed all questions, we will respond to them in writing and send you that after the session, so you can see, you can have an answer to all the questions that are raised. Just to make sure you don't fall asleep, we'll be running some interactive polls in the session. And actually, Hannah, if you could get the first one going so that people can see what happens. You should see that pop up on the right-hand side. Short question, and invite you to submit your response. And again, we'll be able to see that as we go through the webinar. So I think that's it really. So let's get going with the first question. Chris, if I can turn to you firstly, perhaps just a 30-second introduction to what is recovery planning and why do you think it's important for us to do that?
Well, I mean, I think the pandemic for most of us, and certainly what we saw, came as a bit of a shock. And it caused a huge amount of volumes to sort of spike up. And there's a huge amount. I mean, everyone we've spoken to has been hugely busy, just in terms of like how do they react to that, how do they get people off site, how do they think about the residents and how they're dealing with it, how do you think about overdue amounts or accounts that are in arrears, and really the recovery planning is just thinking about well where are we going to with the new normal, and how do we start thinking about step by step, how does it return back to either normal or at least some sort of stability really as well. And I think that's really where we're doing some work around that from an exit plan point of view, but that's really what the recovery planning is like what are the steps and what is the plan now we've reached some sort of semi-stability.
Great, thank you. Nick, quarter one's now over and done with, so what's that brought for you in terms of performance and connections?
I think we've got the stats that London authorities have shared. So certainly for my own authority, council tax, we are down on collection by about 1.5%. Business rates is down by about 7%. But the value of the cash losses that authorities are seeing in terms of potential deficits on collection funds are huge. And in London, having a quick look, the figures for council tax vary between around the million mark up to about sort of 5 or 6 million. But when you start looking at the business rates losses on collection fund, they vary again from about £1 million for a couple of the smaller authorities up to like 30 million on quarter one. So when you're looking at some of the big authorities who've got huge intake, some of the authorities who have, things like the airport, for example, the collection fund is way down. So I think to a certain extent, when we talk about the recovery planning, some of the authorities haven't bottomed out yet. And I think that's what we need to be cautious of about launching our significant recovery plans when in certain cases we might not have even hit the bottom of where we are in terms of the ongoing collection.
Jonathan, what's the view in Redbridge at the moment?
Well, I underline what Nick said in a lot of that. For Redbridge, we're seeing similar numbers, somewhere between 1% cash loss so far this year. But I mean, we're saying that today at quarter one, but we're anticipating, because we have a lot of residents that have asked us to defer those instalments to later times in the year, that actually they will pick up. But by how much, and will we get that strategy right in recovering those funds, which we need to do, because we all know that if we allow it to slip into a later year, we risk actually collecting that money. I think the other thing I'll just pick up is, I'm getting myself coming back, am I? Or is it clear?
But it's okay, keep going.
Okay. So the other thing I was going to underline is the fact that we've probably bottomed out on some of the pressure that we've had coming through. We've certainly not seen, as Nick said, we've not seen the risks, some of the losses come through yet. We're still yet to see those enforcement actions start. We haven't got the court work started yet, so we've by far got through this, but we may well be over the first phase.
Okay, great, thank you. David, so given what both Nick and Jonathan are saying about not quite reaching the bottom and possibly there's still some hangover with all the in trying to sort of implement all the new initiatives that we had to do in the last sort of quarter to deal with this current crisis, are we actually in a position to start recovery planning or not?
Well, it's never too early to start planning, and particularly recovery planning. But the real problem at the moment is that we're nowhere near the bottom. It's early days. We're just into the financial year. As we say, we're talking about quarter one. There are so many things going on around us. The big issues have yet to be resolved. Just looking at COVID-19 generally and the government's policies. Obviously, as far as council tax is concerned, there are lots of people who are currently in work, lots of people who are furloughed. We've got no idea what the impact's going to be on redundancies, so we're going to start to see the impact of that around about sort of October time, and that's when people are becoming under a lot of pressure with their domestic bills. As far as business is concerned, we're seeing the gradual sort of opening up of business, but it's all very slow. And of course, all the companies are saying that they're in real difficulty and their customers are not there. And what is the new normal? We've got no idea what the new normal is. Every day something else changes. That's bound to impact on the economy. We've seen the recent figures about the way the economy has been shrinking. And then, of course, you look at the things that are affecting sort of day-to-day work of Nick and all his colleagues and Jonathan and the rest of the people around the country. We've got a government that are constantly changing things. Only yesterday, a paper came out, which we'll discuss later, no doubt, on the deficits in the collection fund. There is the possibility of the breathing space regulations being laid very shortly. Recovery action is suspended till August, but apparently the regulations that bring the recovery actions back after the middle of August are being prayed against. So there's every possibility that regulation will fall. So it's just the beginning of a very, very difficult time for local authorities.
Okay. Well, looking at the results of our poll, most people feel that local government is well placed at 41%. 2% feel that it's very well placed, but actually there's quite a large proportion who are not sure, 35%, and also actually a quite sizable proportion, 22%, who feel that we're not very well placed. So some mixed views there in terms of whether or not we're ready to begin this process. Hannah, if we could start poll number 2, please, while we go. David, can I come back to you? So, what do you think we need to start beginning this process? What questions should we be asking ourselves, and what should government be doing to assist us?
Well, I think as far as the individual local authorities are concerned, every local authority is different. They've all got different sort of socio-economic structures. They've got differences in relation to business rates and the success or otherwise. Nick mentioned the airport. There are those sorts of factors all around. We saw yesterday on the news that Luton Borough Council is in real difficulty with their revenues because they rely on Luton Airport because they own it. There are loads of different factors that are impacting on local authorities. But what local authorities have got to start doing is looking ahead, looking at the debt that they're owed, looking at the profiling that debt, and just making sure that they fully understand the position of their debtors. The real impact of COVID-19, as I said already, has not been fully felt yet. I think the pressures on business, of course, the real problem is that if you're administering rate income, the big issues have not yet faced us because the big issues are around liability. There are large office blocks in central London and around the country that are effectively empty. They're empty in the sense that they are not being used, but they are full of furniture and everything else, but the employees can't get in. Now, that's bound to attract challenges. We're already seeing ratepayers taking advice on whether they're in beneficial occupation or not. That's bound to surface as an issue in the near future. Of course, there are COVID-19 appeals because of a material change of circumstance. Those appeals are beginning to surface. We have one major chartered surveyor who is promoting a class action on a material change of circumstance. That could have a dramatic effect. And of course, these issues take a long time to come through the sausage machine. So they'll be sort of hanging over local government. And of course, when you get liability challenges, very similar to the ATM situation, they can go to the Supreme Court and they could be outstanding for a couple of years. There are real major problems facing local authorities. And the figures that Jonathan and Nick outlined earlier on give you just an idea of the way things are going.
Just a message to our audience. We don't seem to have many questions in at the moment, so feel free to ask them away, and I shall come to the panel on your behalf. Chris, can I turn to you, please? Obviously, we've been, as Aaron, talking to lots of companies in many industries about the current impact of COVID and how to get out of it. What advice are you offering your clients about what kind of priorities they should be looking to address through their recovery plan?
I think, and I just go back on a previous comment. I agree. I just don't think it's too early to plan. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and I also agree with that. But I think it's also, planning early just enables you to get ahead of it. I mean, there's some things that we know and some things we don't know, and some things we know with some certainty, and other things which we know that haven't really come through yet. And it's really around how do we think about the things with certainty, put plans in around those. And I think it's things like, safety of employees. I mean, that number absolutely has to come number one. safety of residents has to come up at number 2. So we've got to think about both of those, because that's that's often who we are. And then it's really around how do we then act in people's best interests and come to the best outcomes. I think priorities really that we've seen elsewhere have been really around, we know we've had to work off site. I think digital enablement is one of the pieces that's definitely come forward, certainly elsewhere. And really that's a question around how do you test for segments of the population, in this case residents, how do you are the segments of that you can take through a digital journey that will take cost out, that will help you manage volume. So one of the things we know is there's going to be volume that's going to go through, and digital's a ways of doing that. How do you use that to basically gather information or gather data to then inform that segmentation around who you need to go to what particular path, the different actions, or even people who then need to have, are in difficult situations, or people who need to have that human contact. It's really around getting the right volume to the right channel and really maximizing the use of the resource you've currently got. So safety of employees, safety of residents, and then how do you work your process really to try and manage that volume the best you can within the price points and in sort of the budget you've got.
Okay, thank you. Nick, looking at our poll so far, which has just ended, 89% of our audience think that councils should start making their own plans, that we shouldn't hang around waiting for government to perhaps tell us what to do. What sort of challenges do you find in actually putting together your plans, and how are you looking to overcome them?
Yeah, I think I would stress that probably most authorities have been making recovery plans of some extent since day one. As soon as you know there's a situation, the first thing you've got to try and do is work your way out of it. So recovery planning has been ongoing in most cases throughout the whole of the COVID situation. I think the difficulty, as David alluded to, is what the government are going to do in terms of financial support for local authorities. And it is a financial situation for authorities. We're facing huge losses, and we do need to know what the government is going to do in terms of providing that support. And David will cover, some of the suggestions a bit later. But we just need to start getting our own ship in order, I suppose, effectively, to know what actions we're going to be taking on the elements that we can control. We can't control what central government are going to do in terms of financial support for the authority. What we can do is control what actions we're going to be taking to minimise the effects and the financial gap that we may have at the end of the financial year. And I'm sure all the authorities listening to this call have commenced that long ago, and it's a continually changing picture.
Thank you. Jonathan, as a revenues manager, what are your priorities for the coming year, and how are you addressing those in your planning process?
Well, I was just thinking of bringing that back, what Nick and David have said, and bringing that back to our local teams. The pressures have changed now. Whilst the authorities got financial pressures, the team have now got to deal with a different type of problem on the telephone, in writing, looking at what arrangements we're making. So I'm questioning perhaps, have we got the right number of staff available to actually work those cases? Because this is an additional pressure, this is an additional amount of work. Are we resourced for that? And I'm not convinced that we've got enough people to be able to support those individuals properly. Because I think the conversations we're going to need to have with residents now is going to take a longer amount of time than it might have done previously. We'd have bitten someone's hand off if they're going to want to make an arrangement to defer their account for a couple of weeks or a month or a couple of months or so. We'd be kind of keen to do that. Now I'm thinking we need to be understanding a bit more about that household, because we need to be sure that we need to signpost them to the right places. We need to make sure that they've got adequate support in the event that there's a recession. And then there's also the situation of the council tax support availability. I know from my authority we've reduced that level of support to its bare minimum in lots of ways. We're still trying to make sure that fits the overall budget, and also then support the right customers, or as many customers as possible. But of course there are still people that are the wrong side of that line. So our work is going to be working those cases, and that's going to take a lot longer. Because coming back to have you got the right number of staff, and have those staff got the right training to deal with this new environment, this new world? Clearly, the measures that we put in place before, the sausage factory process of issuing a reminder, issuing a summons, and then turning up at court and just going through the run-of-the-mill, issuing it to the enforcement agent, isn't going to work if we actually want proper engagement and understand these households' problems properly.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions from our audience around the role of courts and the fact that we don't have a huge amount of information about when the court process might start, when hearings might start again. How are you addressing that particular challenge, and what contingencies are you putting?
Shall I pick that up first? Yeah, sorry, I missed the last bit. Okay, cool. So actually, we've already started engaging with our partner, our local authorities, our neighbouring authorities that share a court with us. We've tried to understand how we're each approaching it, what our individual local needs are, and we've also engaged our local court. And I think there's a conversation that's underway at the moment that will with the court that will allow us to move that forward. We're really keen to look at this, and perhaps the old cliche of an opportunity of a crisis comes to mind, because we can now perhaps move these liability orders into a proper age of getting these cases cleared through the court without the rigmarole of having to drag people to the court hearing. So I think there might be something in that. As long as we, of course, don't want to deny anybody any legal opportunity to be represented, but I'm sure we've got ways to mitigate against those risks. So I think it's underway, but we're far clearer of an answer.
Absolutely. Nick, we've had a couple of questions around sort of the impact of debt on perhaps new debtors, those who previously haven't been in debt and all of a sudden find themselves in position. And I just remember back to our previous webinar, some of the stats that we found that, there are a lot of new people, perhaps almost up to 1 million people who now will find themselves in debt that previously weren't in debt before. How were you addressing that scenario where you've got previously really good payers who perhaps through no fault of their own now find themselves in a difficult position?
I think there's a number of ways you've got to approach it. I think, as Jonathan's alluded to, it's signposting to actually show people what support's available to them. There are things like council tax support. Authorities are offering payment holidays. We've got flexible arrangements that we can offer people. But really, the crux of the matter is dealing with each case individually, because everyone will have very different circumstances, and it's finding out what that person's circumstances are. Have they been furloughed? Have they seen a significant reduction in pay? Is this likely to be temporary or permanent? And I think you need to have that flexibility in your approach from customer to customer. And I think, again, we've talked already about the sort of sausage factory or the conveyor belt approach to recovery. That just can't happen anymore, because we know that each debtor will have very different circumstances. And I think you've got to get an understanding of that to work out what approach you're going to be taking for each person. And certainly for us, we're using a lot of support from external agencies, from the likes of Step Change, from MAPS, people like that, who can provide that external support in terms of signposting and guidance for potentially new debtors as well. I think what we are finding is a lot of people do want to be able to pay us, but genuinely can't. And I think that's one of the things we've always strived to find, between the difference between the can't pays and the won't pays. And if someone genuinely cannot afford to pay us, then we offer support, and we try to work out when or what arrangement we can make with the people, which is mutually agreeable to both of us.
David, sorry, Hannah, could I have poll number 3, please? Thank you. David, again, coming back to the courts and sort of, the lack of uncertainty around some of these things. What's the view in central government around sort of, the challenges around restarting recovery processes? And how do government recognise that we need answers to some of these questions sooner rather than later?
Well, I think the government recognise it, but remember, the court service is it's part of the overall administration of the country. The court service is well organised. They actually, since the crisis started, they've been issuing weekly newsletters, and it's worth local authorities actually picking up those newsletters every week, because what they basically do is they tell you exactly what the situation is in relation to the various tiers of the court. And you can see exactly where the priority for liability orders rests, and you won't be surprised to find out that it's right at the bottom. And it's one of the lowest priorities. And of course, when you look at some of the issues that the courts are dealing with on a daily basis, you can understand why it is at the bottom. So that priority is not going to change in the short term. The government are communicating through the Her Majesty's Court Services with the court users The newsletter comes out on a weekly basis. It gives detailed information. You can actually get regional information as well. So there's no shortage of trying to keep people informed. The real problem, of course, is that the crisis is affecting the operation of the courts, and that's the reality of the situation. So your procedures for liability orders are going to be delayed. Any other procedures you might be wishing to take are bound to be delayed. But the interesting point that came out of the comments made already was the comment made by Jonathan about the process. I think what this might do is trigger a change in the application process. At the moment, we're making complaint to the magistrates. It's something that's been done for many, many years, and it's about time that was modernised, and it's about time that the whole process was looked at, and we streamlined it so we could deal with straightforward issues and get those out of the way in an automatic manner, and then deal with those the challenges in an appropriate way that's modern, as opposed to something that happened sort of 50 years ago. I don't quite go back 50 years, but quite a few years. And I can tell you that the court process has not changed. It was interesting. I was looking at my my own personal library the other evening, and I found my court takers file. And my court takers file goes back quite a long way. I'm not going to tell you. And I bet you that process has not changed one bit. I could use that court takers file tomorrow because the process for application is exactly the same. But we've got to modernise it, and this could be an opportunity to modernise it. And I'm with Jonathan on that. I think there is a real opportunity to do that. As far as Nick is concerned, the point you made about debtors and finding out more, the government's doing quite a lot there. MAPS are ploughing money into the advice agencies. They're coming up with this central contact centre where debtors can ring and get debt advice immediately. They're allocated an advisor. They then are sort of informed about the process and how they can go forward. All the agencies are putting their resources together to make that work. The pilot study is underway. There are about 30 authorities involved in that pilot study. That will be rolled out very shortly. MAPS have just announced another wedge of money come from government to support the advice agencies, to give them more resources to deal with the problems that people are anticipating. So I don't think there's any shortage of the government doing things about the problems that people are facing. But the real issue is getting accurate data of what's going on locally. This is a local issue. And as Nick said, you've got to find out where your debtors are, what their circumstances are. There's the standard statements that you can get completed. There are lots of different things you can do, but the important thing is to differentiate between the can't payer and the won't payer, and concentrate on the can't payer, find out what the issues are, and change your procedures to actually suit that debtor, because these are going to be very personal things, and it's going to take an awful lot of involvement of local authority staff. And again, the point Jonathan made, may be under-resourced, and so there are real challenges ahead.
It looked like you were desperate to say something in the middle of all that. Jonathan?
I was going to try and get him in to help out with our court work.
Very good. Chris, is this, the old adage, never let a crisis go to waste. We've been talking to, clients who are in utilities, example, or in banking. What's the great ideas are coming out from those sectors about different ways of tackling recovery and debtors and those who can't and won't pay that might be useful for local government to consider?
I think it's very similar. I really do. And I think just going back to what Nick was saying around talking with people and gathering that information, but then importantly, just making sure you're documenting the information, because that can then get used for segmentation. So, for example, someone who's in a vulnerable profession, let's say they're a healthcare worker, we know that they might have issues down the road, or someone who's lost their job and maybe they're in an employment that's going to have difficulty getting back on their feet. All of that is important information that can be then used to then inform that segmentation in terms of what actions to take, what conversations to have, what kind of situation they might be in, and trying to get there before they're actually in it. The other thing I think is common is just the piece what Jonathan was saying around automation, and is that an opportunity to sort of like transform the business with maybe more automation, more digital paths. So I think that is very similar, and I think what's been interesting with this crisis so far is certainly in the private sector, there was definitely investment money in the short term. I think that's sort of waning off maybe a little bit now, but it has been enabled some of these processes just out of necessity to move forward. It's almost like the log jam has burst, and now we can get some things done. I think in this sector here, I mean, certainly there's funding gaps, and I think that's one of the issues that has to be kind of addressed, in terms of doing that. But I think it is an opportunity, if you can do it, to really sort of transform some of the processes and put greater intelligence in. I think that digital, I think, for in particular, I think and digital journeys is an opportunity for some segments. Isn't for everyone, but it is definitely for some segments. It can help.
Nick, 45% of our audience think that actually we should be looking for some radical change in terms of collections, approaching CT and NNDR collections. Who should be pushing for that radical change? Where does that drive come from?
I think all of us. I mean, I was very interested, and I totally agree with the poll results that almost everyone thought that the status quo approach just won't cut it going forward, and we need change, which I think is encouraging. I think we've all got a responsibility on that. Yes, bodies like London Revenues Group, like the IRRV, have a role to play for the lobbying for change. But on an individual level, we all have relationships with our local MPs, professionally as well as personally. And I think if it's a legislative change we need to go and do the lobbying. If it's change in the working relationships with your court, pick up the phone and speak to them. We've got a meeting in London with the court service tomorrow to talk about a potentially new approach to court hearings, and that will be using local authority buildings rather than the courtrooms. So in other words, the customers would come to us, and there would be some sort of web service link for hearings or meetings to take place. And I think we need to be leading ourselves to drive those changes. At the moment, everyone is inundated. Most people are in backlog situations. And the one thing people don't want to be doing is introducing major change programs. But we need these changes now. So I think it's down to everyone to play that role, to actually lobby, encourage, vocalise any concerns you've got, but also ideas. It's all well and good people criticising and saying this isn't going to work. Think about what will work. And quite often I think if you come up with an approach that someone else thinks, yes, that could work, that would be a far better way than just us throwing our hands up in the air and saying, oh dear, what are we going to do next?
David, I seem to recall the Institute having an idea about a minimum income guarantee. Give us a bit more information about that and how you think that might help us to drive some innovation in collections recovery.
Well, basically, we were looking through our faculty boards. We were looking at the wider issues, particularly in relation to the difficulties local authorities are going to have in collecting their charges, not for this year, but for next year, the year after, and most likely for the next 3 years. And so we wrote to the minister, well, various ministers a few weeks ago, suggesting a guaranteed income agreement where the government would actually guarantee local authority income through over the next 4 years. That's 4 years, including the current financial year, based on previous performance, so that you could be guaranteed that, irrespective of how well or poorly the local authority performed, that they would be guaranteed that income, and that income would be topped up by some form of interest-free loan that would not be repayable until the end of the 4-year period. The idea of that was to give local authorities the option, particularly in relation to council tax and businesses in distress, the opportunity for long-term plans, one to protect the family, and as far as industry is concerned, to protect the industry and to make sure that industries survive this crisis. Now, we saw that, and we still see it as a long-term option, actually helping ratepayers and council taxpayers meet their debts and taking the pressure off the local authorities to put those debtors under pressure to pay. What's happened in the last couple of days, literally yesterday, is the MHCLG have come up with an idea, their own idea, about collection fund deficits. And what they've suggested is that the deficit for this year can be spread over the following 3 years. Now, so 30% this year, and then two chunks of 30% for the following 2 years. Now, on the face of it, that to me seems like a pretty hopeless option. Okay, it's fine in terms of the operation of the collection fund, and it'll keep the accountants quiet for a few minutes. But the real issue is about collecting the money, and that doesn't make any difference to the local authority's performance. What we need Why shouldn't we go for radical change? We need to see things change. The application process for enforcement for business rates and for council tax is out of date. It's outmoded. It's still the process that was carried on, as I said, 50 years ago. Let's change that. That could easily be automated. That could easily be dealt with by written representations. There are no difficulties in putting these things in place, and it doesn't need primary legislation. This can all be dealt with by regulation, so it can be dealt with very quickly. You would then only deal with cases where there is a challenge. So that would make an immediate difference. And then as far as helping the council taxpayer or the business rate payer is concerned, is let's start changing the way we do things. Let's start looking at the various approaches to segmentation. Let's get local authorities as a norm to use those processes that have been used in the private sector for a number of years. As far as the business rate power is concerned, of course, we have, and people have forgotten, the business rate system is under pressure. It's up for fundamental review. Perhaps the government should be looking at reducing the multiplier to actually take the pressure off business. Perhaps that's the only reform that's needed. And then alongside that, look for other sources of local authority revenue. There are lots of things that can be done. We must turn this crisis into an opportunity.
Jonathan, do you think the initiatives that David has mentioned there, like the minimum guarantee or the proposal from the Ministry of Housing and Local Government yesterday, will that give you as a revenues manager the space that you need to perhaps step back and reimagine some of these collection processes or not?
I think they need to be run in parallel, because for us, if we're still looking at debt recovery, the most effective way to recover that debt is to collect it as soon as it's due. So that has to be in the year in which it's due, which means that we don't let our foot off the gas when it comes to pursuing those that won't pay. Again, we've already covered the can't pay versus won't pay, and it's important to make that differentiation. Nevertheless, we need to pursue the debt in the year that it's due, because we know that the cyclical nature of council tax and business rates just compounds the problem, and it doesn't go away. It's not something that you can put freeze so it doesn't accrue like a loan or a credit card. These are quite unique types of debts with their unique solutions. So I'm not convinced that deferring those deficits on the collection fund is the right solution, because in later years, when we still don't collect that money, we're still going to be having the deficit that we've got will be offset against any growth that we've got, and we need that growth. The boroughs need to improve their income, the capacity to raise income, and that's only through their growth. There is very little other option in that area with the current regime. So I'm not convinced it's a solution. David's solution, the IRRV solution proposal, moves that out enormously, and I think that's something which we should be exploring. I've got to say, I'm not in a position to judge it and to critique it, because I haven't studied it well enough. But I know that from a perspective of not collecting debt soon enough, it's just a problem that's not going to go away.
Okay. Nick, in terms of thinking about the planning horizon, when we're thinking about obviously an improvement program, a recovery program, what kind of planning period should we be thinking about? 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, perhaps even 10 years? What do you think?
I think there's a number of different phases we're going to have to go through. I mean, we are all doing short-term planning, and short-term planning, I'm talking about the next month, the things that we need to do. We've already talked about the potential reintroduction of enforcement. So what are the authorities doing? Are you issuing reminders? Have you started discussions with your court? Have you had discussions with, chief officers, with lead members around potential reintroduction of enforcement? And they are decisions that will happen immediately. In terms of the longer term financial issues around the collection of some of this money, I think you're talking years. And some of the, as I said earlier, some of the issues that are going to come out of COVID, we won't even see yet, because of the furlough scheme has hidden away a lot of the issues that we're going to be faced with in the coming months, when suddenly furlough ends and these people won't have jobs to go back to. And I think the hit we're going to get on benefit services, on council tax reduction schemes, is going to be absolutely immense. And again, that's going to bring a whole new raft of issues, measures and strategic plans that we're going to have to follow on with to deal with those as well. So I think at the moment you need to be planning now. In terms of long term, I think we're talking years in terms of a recovery plan to correct the losses that local authorities are going to find following COVID. And plus, we still don't know what the future with COVID is going to be. You know, if you look at the scenarios of some of the other countries where you're going back into secondary lockdowns, if there would be a second spike later in the year, the financial implications of that will be huge for local authorities.
Just to survey the results of the final poll, David, 38% of our audience haven't heard about the proposal from the RIV, so I think it might be something that's worthy of further communication coming forward. Hannah, could we also have a poll about the deferred payment proposal, please, as well? Sorry, deferred. Gave you earlier. Sorry, got that right. Chris, let me come back to you. So you've been hosting some webinars with utilities over the past few months around sort of their approach to COVID and you know what they can do. What appetite do you see in that sector? Coming back to sort of this issue about the priority of debts, that actually utilities, local government, the third sector, perhaps might be working together in a different way that perhaps they haven't done before to deal with customers who might have multiple debts across all those industries.
I mean, a lot of that comes through the debt advice agencies who do work across multiple sectors. I think that, I mean, that some of that stuff does happen. I think it's an interesting idea in terms of if you'd actually sort of coordinate it more. I mean, the reality is, I mean, that be they residents, be they customers in different industries, they're all the same person, right? And they all have, you know, overdue amounts in different locations. So it's really around. I mean, they, in the end, they have to be dealt holistically, and they have to have a holistic approach to them. You know, I think the more coordinated it can be within, you know, legislation or, you know, respecting the customer's desires, I think the bigger the opportunity is. I do agree with Jonathan. I mean, even in the private sector as well. I mean, like pushing things down the road means that the likelihood of collections reduces, right? And I think that's the same everywhere. So I do think sort of like, you know, getting on top of it now, having workable arrangements now from a customer relationship point of view really makes a difference. And we don't know how long it's going to last. And sort of like addressing the issue now, finding solutions, you know, at a customer level really sort of can really help. It's not been discussed widely in terms of like how do you do that holistically. There's opportunities for things like open banking and stuff like that, but it's I think it's an interesting idea.
Okay. Nick mentioned quite earlier that we don't know actually where we are with COVID right now and what might happen. Given sort of looking back over the past 3 months, what things do you think we should be doing now to mitigate against perhaps a second wave and some of the problems that might bring? Chris?
For me, I think investing now. I mean, so we had the initial panic that came through, I suppose, and we had to react to that situation. I kind of feel like, although there's still a lot of work, and everyone who talk to is just incredibly busy, and I know there's huge amounts of work going on in the background, but we are in a bit of a period of stability over the summer. I mean, the caseload has come down. The you know, things are starting to relax a little bit from an open point of view, but we don't know what's going to happen in the back end of the year. So now's the opportunity, I think, to plan. If you can get investment around digital, if you can understand and capture what customers' current situations are, you gather that information now, because we've got to think about what will happen in the winter. I mean, so if there is a second lockdown, do we have processes that are going to be flexible? You know, can we work off site? Can that be 100% working off site? You know, so the process is robust, not just recovering from where we are now, but like if there was something to happen in the future, making sure that's robust for a return to lockdown, as an example. I think now's the time to do it, because we've got, although it doesn't feel like it, we've got a little bit of breathing space potentially now, and it'll either get us ahead on any recovery plan, or just put us in a better position should something else happen, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan, a term that I'm using more with lots of my clients is building resilience, okay? Because shocks will always happen, and this one clearly is a major shock. What kind of things do you think your service and other similar services can do to actually build resilience to any future second waves or third waves potentially that might be coming along?
Well, I think it comes back to what Chris said. You know, we weren't ready for something like COVID-19, but we responded, and I think right across the organisation, all organisations, we've had to respond. We've had to lead, and we've made huge changes to the way that we're structured to do that. I think we demonstrated that we do have the resilience to switch these services on, to stand them up to the service levels that we need to, and they need to be agile enough to cope with that kind of response that's required. Have we learned anything from it? You know, it's classic, isn't it? We'll probably move on to the next problem before we've really considered and gone back to really really grasp, the way we could change, the way we would have done this had we had the chance to plan it properly. But you know, as with all these things, resilience will sort of bed in. Some of the things will stick, some of the things won't. I'm not sure at the moment we are ready for a second wave. As Chris said, you know, services are being delivered in very different ways. We've got all of my team are still working at home. I don't see any reason for us to rush back to working in an office environment. If it weren't for the attendance of attending court, we wouldn't even be thinking about trying to procure any PPE for our staff, because you know, we've got some inquiry officers doing some work, but the 99% of them aren't in that position. We don't need to. We're very safe working at home. So the resilience is kind of inbuilt by the capability of working remotely, and we're probably going to continue in this way. My staff won't thank me if I said I can see us being here to the new year. I just don't see any reason why we'd rush back, and I think that would then take care of any second wave, if there is one in this calendar year, or any other incident in the future. I think what we've demonstrated is we don't need these big, shiny, tall office buildings to accommodate our services. Having said that, nor do the banks and some of the insurance companies, so that is another problem for local authorities when it comes to empty office blocks.
Great. Nick, looking back over the last sort of few months, what's the one thing that you want to build on and the one thing you want to ditch going forward?
I think a huge positive have been the reaction of staff. I mean, I cannot speak highly enough about how flexible and willing the staff have been. I think we all alluded at the start what a nightmare 3 months it's been, and workloads, I've never known anything like it in my 30 plus years in local authority debt collection. But the support and flexibility throughout the organisation has just been stunning, and that's not just within my own organisation. We've had numerous meetings across London through LRG, IRRV have stepped up and given support where required, and I think the general teamwork across the whole industry, if I can call it that, has been phenomenal, and I think that will continue. We've always worked fairly closely together between authorities, you know, using the likes of IRRV, but I think that will just improve even further, and I think that is the one positive I would take out of it, the way that we've all pulled together. And touch wood, you know, hopefully in 6 months' time we can turn around and say, you know, we got through this by working in true partnership.
We ran, as you were talking, we ran a quick poll about the proposal to spread the deficits over 3 years, and 45% of our audience think that it probably won't incentivise changes to collection practice, but 47% are not sure. So the jury's out on that one. Now, I believe we've got Joseph with us. Joseph, are you there?
Hi, Boyd. Yes, I am here indeed.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Okay. So just for I introduced you earlier, let me just repeat that. Joseph is the head of policy for the government debt management function at the Cabinet Office, and I believe you're running a consultation on fairness in the collection of government debts that you'd like to talk to us about, Joseph.
Yeah, that's right. And I was asked just to come along to give a quick update on that. Options for responding, and then as I understood it, there wouldn't really be time for questions, but I'll provide my email address, so if anybody does have any questions or wants to speak to me after this, they should absolutely feel free to do so. And I'll proceed with that.
Over to you.
Anything else?
No, over to you. Please start about that.
For those of you who aren't familiar with the government debt function, which I'm sure most of you are, having met Steve Coppard, who's well known by everybody in the industry. Essentially what we do is we work with government departments and arm's length bodies to ensure consistency in government debt recovery where possible and drawing attention to best standards. Obviously, over the last couple of months, we've been very busy with COVID-19 issues, but we're also very interested and very keen to ensure that government debt recovery, debt management keeps pace with the industry and sort of makes up some of the ground and the areas where we know we're lagging behind. So we know there was the National Audit Office report that said government in places wasn't doing the best job it possibly could. There was also criticism from the Treasury Select Committee. So in order to do this sort of most effectively, to take in as wide a range as possible of views and evidence and insight that we can then use to develop future policy, we've launched a call for evidence. Now, this is sort of quite a wide-ranging document. It's not proposing any new policies at the moment, but it's looking into a range of sort of specific issues that we know are problematic for debt management in general, but probably particularly for a lot of government work. So that is affordability assessments for one, treatment of vulnerability, disputes resolution, treatment of complaints. We've also got a specific section in there around responding to fraud, how to identify fraudulent debt and to enforce against that appropriately. Now, I know that probably every civil servant says this, but we are generally very open and honest and really want feedback from as wide a range of participants as possible to know what you think, so we can share that with our government colleagues, which we'll be doing, and then feed it into some of the sort of ongoing thinking around how government can do better, in particular with the treatment of vulnerability and the treatment of fraud. The call for evidence document itself is hosted on gov.uk. I can provide the full URL for to be sent around after this meeting, but if you just Google debt fairness call for evidence, that will come up. It was launched on the 29th of June for a full 12-week consultation period. So that should be completing on the 21st of September, following which we will publish a sort of summary of responses. Alongside that, we also know that many organisations may or may not have the ability to put in a full written response. It's a relatively long document, relatively a large number of questions. So we'll also be holding a couple of sort of digital workshops, not too dissimilar to this, take on board responses from organisations who may not have the time or capacity to do a full written response. I'm very happy to share the details of those if anybody on the call is interested. My personal email address at work is joseph.surtees, SURTEES, at cabinetoffice.gov.uk. So if anybody would like to find out more about the call for evidence, participate in these workshops, or just discuss some of the issues they're seeing in more detail, please absolutely feel free to get in contact. I think that's pretty much the suite of information that's necessary. Please, I just urge people to check out that document. I am very happy to take questions now if that's possible. And if not, again, I just emphasise that people can and should feel absolutely free to get in contact with me at any point over the next sort of 10 weeks and discuss this in more detail, discuss any of the issues that you're seeing, both pre-COVID-19, but also some of the sort of future focused issues you might think come into relief slightly more starting towards the end of this year.
Yes, unfortunately, the format we've got today doesn't allow for immediate question and answer type sessions, because it takes a few minutes for the questions to come through on our platform. But if people would like to submit their questions, what we will do is forward those to Joseph, and then we can include the answer in our mail outs after this session. We'll also include links to the document that Joseph referred to and his contact details as well, if people would like to contact him directly on that. So thank you for that. Okay. One of the other proposals that we've had, you'll see a new poll coming up in a few seconds, is that, as Joseph mentioned, not everyone will have perhaps the time or the capacity to, at this moment in time, to submit a full response. So it's been suggested that what we can do is, as Arum, is perhaps facilitate some workshops, some discussions, and perhaps even host a series of webinars like this again to try and generate some of that discussion and forward comments on your behalf to the Cabinet Office to contribute to that call for evidence. So if you'd like to be part of that, please respond using the poll that's just come out right now. Okay.
And
so
I think that's... Sorry, I was just going to say, we'd obviously, myself or another member of the function, would be very happy to come along to any meetings that either you or your partners organise to discuss this in more detail. I realise it's been a bit of a whistle stop, go through it, but if you want to talk about this in more detail at any point, we're always happy and available to do so.
Great, thank you. I think if there's sufficient interest from people who are joining us today, then I think there's clearly demand for perhaps another series of webinars like this, where you can perhaps join us, Joseph, and we can discuss some of those issues in a bit more detail. I think that certainly might be welcome, depending on how people feel about that. So we're almost to the end of our time. Can I just thank everybody who is on the call with us, David Mago, Nick Rowe, Jonathan Woolfridge, Chris Warburton, and Joseph Surtees, and particularly to Nick, Jonathan, and David, who've joined us for the past 3 webinars. The feedback that we've had has been brilliant. You might be happy to know that we have 113 people still on the call today, so actually the numbers have gone up through this series of webinars. So clearly you are making a big difference. And as I said earlier, the feedback we've had is that our audience really do welcome your insight and experience that you've built over the many, many years that you've been involved in collections. Also of interest, hopefully, too, is that the advice that you've heard today about planning and some of the things that other industries are doing, Arum is actually putting together what we're calling a playbook, which sort of collates all that advice about how you could be improving your collections going forward, what things you could be thinking about as part of that planning process. So we'll be launching that playbook, which is sort of tailored towards colleagues in the public sector around revenues, council tax, and business rates collection during the course of the next week. So we'll be sending a link to that out to you after the session again today. Okay. So, and one final thing before we go is your feedback is always welcome. So please, after this webinar concludes, you should get a link to a survey. We're very grateful if you could complete that on our behalf. And finally, just in terms of the numbers on the poll, I think 40% of you so far have said that you would actually like to be involved in some further discussions around fairness to government management for evidence. So I shall take that back to my colleagues and let's look to try and organise some webinars going forward and some opportunities for us to issues that Joseph raised earlier. So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon, and hopefully we shall see you all again soon. Take care.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.